One of the interesting things that happens to me when I'm out there in the woods is when I get back from a canoe trip. And a lot of the times when I get back from a canoe trip and I bring my friends together who are non-outdoorsy kind of people, and I forced my sort of photographs and things onto them, is inevitably they end up asking me a question. And the question they end up asking is a variation sort of on this. They'll say, so Jeff, when you're out there in nature, when you're out there in the great outdoors, Jeff, does anything happen to you? And I kind of say, well, what do you mean? And they say, well, you know, like, do you have some sort of insights? Do you have some sort of a spiritual or an existential moment? Jeff, when you commune with nature, like, do you see the face of God? Do you realize that you're one with the universe? All those big uber things, you know? And I always feel kind of a little badly at that point because I'd like to be able to provide with some deep, profound insight, but the truth of the matter is, my usual answer is, no, the food was good, the portages weren't bad, that's about it. Nothing like, no road to Damascus moments. But I got to thinking about it, and I thought, you know, if ever I was going to share an insight with a group of people, I'm never going to get this many people together to share an insight. So I thought about it a lot and decided that, yes, there is one thing I have learned over my lifetime of outdoors experience, and maybe this is a venue and the forum to share it if you'll be so generous as to bear with me. So here's what I have learned. I've come to the conclusion over a lifetime of paddling in the outdoors that as a general guiding principle to my life, I'm not a big fan of outdoor sex. That's all I got. Now, I'll clarify. Nothing against sex. Sex is fine. It's simply the outdoor variety of the act which I find particularly distressing. There are just so many things that can go terribly wrong out of doors. Think about it. An ill-timed mosquito, an unfortunately placed pebble, sand, bugs, poison ivy, passers-by. If you think about it, outdoor sex is a veritable hornet's nest of dangers and distractions. Yeah, there's another one, right? Yeah, hornet's nest. And if you think about it even further, what's the, well, upside of outdoor sex supposed to be anyway? The scenery, the aesthetics? Well, I won't speak for any of you other gentlemen in the room this evening, but I, for one, am not looking up mid-act to comment on the haunting call of the loon. Or to rhapsodize on some sunset's fading purple glow. Those sort of external distractions can all too quickly lead to scenery interruptus. So if you want my best general advice on outdoor sex, then if you really need to, use those soft, sandy beaches, those crackling campfires, and those starry, starry nights to set the stage. But then, take the serious action into the tent. You'll have a much better time. Your partner and your knees will thank you for it. But all of that said, even I, if pressed, would be forced to concede that there have in my own life been times, rare, special times, when coitus al fresco has been freaking awesome. And for a few brief moments on a sunny July afternoon, almost 20 years ago, well, it nearly was. Here's how that day went down. Jennifer and I found ourselves marooned on a small rock on a huge body of water. We were alone in northern Quebec in a canoe trip. Hadn't seen a soul in 5 days. We had just paddled into a large lake when the winds and the waves had suddenly picked up, and we were forced to get off the water in a hurry. Well, it turned out that the nearest shelter was a tiny postage stamp little island in the middle of the lake. So we paddled to it as quickly as we could. We landed, we secured our canoe, we pitched our tent, and, well, then we settled in to wait out the wind and the waves. Now, there wasn't an awful lot to see or do on that little island. But Jennifer observed that the rock down near the shoreline was smooth, flat, and pleasingly warmed by the sun. Jennifer inquired if I had any interest in a temporary suspension of my general guiding principle. Well, under some duress, I agreed. And I suppose the most eloquent way of phrasing the next section of the story is to say, for the next little while, we are both rather lost in the moment. That is, until Jennifer suddenly looked up and let out a piercing scream. And there, directly offshore of our island, bearing straight towards us at great speed, was a motorboat. There were 2 men on that motorboat, and those men looked sketchy. One of them could have been an overweight version of G.I. Joe. He was dressed head to toe in green camouflage gear. His partner, well, he looked like some sort of a dissolute lumberjack, a shocking red bush jacket, and a clashingly terrible orange fluorescent hat. Well, Jennifer and I, in a panic, leapt up stark naked and sprinted for the relative privacy of our tent. Inside the tent began the frantic search for clothes. Now, Jennifer was fine. Her clothes bag was in the tent, so she got dressed. But my clothes bag was not in the tent. It was down by that flat, smooth rock by the shore. It had been a very useful pillow only moments earlier. I had nothing at all in the tent to wear. Well, one thing, my red Speedo bathing suit. Ultralight, fast drying, perfect for a canoe trip, but, well, more thong than coverage, if truth be told. But it was all I had, so I slipped it on. Meanwhile, Jennifer had collapsed into bouts of giddy, uncontrollable laughter. No, it wasn't the Speedo, okay? It was the effect of all that adrenaline on her brain. But all of that adrenaline was doing something completely different to her mate. I started to panic. They saw you, I said. Those men saw you. They saw you naked, and now they're coming to get you. Help me find a weapon. I need a weapon. I fumbled frantically through the contents of my tiny tent, looking for something I could use to defend my mate. But the only thing in the tent was a little 2-inch Swiss Army knife. 2-inch blade, tweezers, but a pretty lethal-looking corkscrew. Well, if it came to a fight, I decided the corkscrew would have to do. I went to put it in my pocket. Realized I had none, so improvised, and stuffed the knife between my butt cheeks. Now, all the while that I panicked thus, Jennifer sat in the other end of the tent, observing her mate in mute anthropological fascination, waiting for the inevitable adrenaline to leave my system, waiting for ancient fight or flight Jeff to vanish and rational Jeff to return. And eventually, it happened. The adrenaline dissipated, and rational Jeff returned to the tent. And when rational Jeff returned, Jennifer invited rational Jeff to reflect on the premise behind his panic. Did I really believe, Jennifer asked, that 2 men had flown to a remote lake in northern Quebec, rented a boat, donned hunting garb, and were now deliberately cruising the said shoreline of lake, looking for amorous twosomes to join? Was that my genuine belief? And I was kind of forced to concede that it had simply been, well, the shock of being caught in the act with my pants down, which had premised my panic. Now feeling, well, a little bit like an idiot, I exhaled and prepared to leave the tent. Until Jennifer's words froze me. She was looking out the front entrance of the tent. That's interesting, Jeff. That motorboat, it hasn't passed the island and gone down the lake. Jeff, I think they're trying to land on our island. New, fresh adrenaline pounded into my head. Rational Jeff vanished. I reached for my butt cheeks and the knife. In vain, Jennifer tried to talk sense into me. Jeff, she said, I don't think they're landing to get me. Take a look. They need to land. They're in trouble. Well, fight or flight Jeff looked and grudgingly conceded that Jennifer might have a point. Their boat was being hit broadside by the huge waves. The guy up in the front in the camouflage was frantically bailing. His partner in the other end of the boat was trying to restart a stalled engine. But help those men land in my island anywhere near my woman? Not a chance, Jennifer. But my words were wasted, because my wife by this stage was already 2/3 of the way down to the shore and waving at the guys. From the tent I watched. Hey, you guys! Hey, it looks pretty dangerous out there. You might want to land your boat. If you need someplace safe, there's a nice, flat, smooth piece of rock right over here. Not even a hint of irony in her voice. And the men nodded and headed their boat in that direction, starting to land. But I really wasn't paying attention to that rational stuff. Instead, I strode from my tent, wielding my Swiss Army knife, wearing my red bathing suit, and marched down towards the shore to give those guys a bit of what for. Well, they looked up. They appeared to note my presence. And then they, well, carried on with their work, totally unconcerned. And Jennifer, she looked up, she stared at me, she shook her head and sighed. And that moment, ladies and gentlemen, I had a wee little existential crisis. Yeah. Just moments earlier, I had strode from that tent as alpha man, proudly bestriding the Precambrian shield, ready to fight and die for his woman. But it was pretty clear that the rest of the world saw me as middle-aged guy, clad in a tight red Speedo bathing suit, fighting crime with his dangerous 2-inch blade. I don't know if Jennifer had her own little existential crisis in that moment. This is the man I chose to marry. All I do know is what I did next. I sprinted down to the shore. I grabbed my clothes pack. I ran back to my tent. I put on a pair of pants. And then I walked down to the shoreline to help a couple of dudes land a boat. And the interesting thing, folks, is it turned out that Jennifer had been right all along. Those two men, they weren't predators. They were Americans. Up from the United States on a fishing holiday. They told us their story. They had headed out that morning from a fishing lodge at the extreme southern end of the lake without a map, had got turned around, lost, and now were low on fuel, completely disoriented, and on the very edge of panic. It actually took Jennifer a few moments to calm them down, but she pulled out her top map and showed them precisely where in the lake they were and assured them that once the wind and the waves went down, they were only a 45-minute motorboat ride away from safety in their cottage. But we had time to kill for evening, for the wind and waves to die down. So I kindled up the campfire, put on a huge pot of coffee, pulled out the snack bag, and the four of us sat down, and Jennifer and I got to know our American guests. Hunting cap guy, it turned out, was from New York City, did something financial in Manhattan. Well, camouflage guy, of course, was from Texas and in the oil industry. They both took a huge interest in this novel thing that Jennifer and I were doing, this canoe tripping thing. And eventually they asked us a question which non-canoe trippers always ask canoe trippers. It was Texas that posed the question to me. Well, aren't you too afraid of bar? I reckon an angry bar could tear right through a tent like that. Well, once I decoded that bar were bears, well, there must have still been just a little bit of that alpha man adrenaline percolating around in the back of my brain. Because I turned around to our two guests and I told a lie. Summoning my very best inner Clint Eastwood, I spoke. Bears. Bears can be a threat, which is why I always keep a loaded handgun nearby in case of any sort of threat. Well, Jennifer barely suppressed her giggles. I think New York raised a dubious eyebrow. But as for Texas, well, Texas, he seemed genuinely impressed. Well, I say nothing beats the quiet comfort of a handgun. I bring mine with me everywhere, even to the 7-Eleven. We don't even have bar in Texas. I mean, you think about it, what are your other options? Suppose you could always build a wall to keep the bar out. But damned if I know how you get the bar to pay for that wall. Well, sometime later in the evening, the wind and the waves died down, and Jennifer and I said goodbye to our American friends. But the two of us returned to that lake just last summer. We spent a couple of days in the southern reaches exploring, and I confess I was keeping a half-hopeful eye out for my new friends, New York and Texas. I liked the idea of them returning to that lake every summer and regaling that summer's fishing buddies with tall tales of, you won't believe what we saw happening on that very rock a few years back. But we didn't see New York and Texas, so eventually we decided to make our way north in search of our little island. Well, when we got up to the north end of the lake, the islands all looked the same, but we readily found our island. Jennifer had put a little happy face on the top map all those years ago. So we stepped ashore, we secured our canoe, and, well, we explored that little piece of rock. And it turned out that there still wasn't an awful lot to see or do on that island. But Jennifer observed that that rock down by the shore was still smooth, still flat, and pleasingly warmed by the sun. She invited me to consider a temporary suspension of my general guiding principle. Just, she said, for memory's sake. But nothing happened that afternoon. Well, no motorboats came by.